There we go. All right. Chapter 8 is very similar to chapter 7. It actually, in my opinion, is a clearer expression of the history that is being described by these visions. So, we talked in with chapter 7 about apocalypse and what apocalyptic literature is attempting to do, and what it's trying to do. For first and foremost, is answer the question, why is this happening? And so, in chapter 7, we had this uh, vision of these beasts and who are these beasts supposed to represent, and all this kind of thing. In chapter 8, the images are much easier to understand, much easier to connect to historical events, and so it's almost its own explanation of chapter 7 in a way. This chapter also is a lot more specific in terms of the from whose perspective this story is being told. It's clear to us that the story is being told from the perspective of the Jews and their God in this case, whereas in chapter 7, it might be a little bit more ambiguous about who is the protagonist of the story. So I don't have a ton to say about chapter 8 just because it's so similar to chapter 7 in terms of the content of it. But I will say, just before we start, since there are some place names, I'll let you know what those are about. So the setting that is stated at the beginning of this chapter is the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. So again, we are not putting these into the same chronological order with chapters 1 through 6. This is happening before chapter 6, but after chapter 7.
Yeah.
And he says that he finds himself in Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire. So we talked about when we talked about chapter 6, we talked about how Babylon was the capital of the Babylonian Empire. So Daniel was living in the seat of power near the emperor, near the king of the empire, when the Babylonians were in power. But then once Cyrus the Great took over, his capital, of course, was in Persia, and his capital city was called Susa. And so in this vision, it's telling us that he appears in the capital of the Persian Empire. And Ulay is a waterway near Susa, where he specifically expresses that he is located in the dream. It's interesting that they would describe it in this way, because it's very unlikely that a Jew in exile in Babylon would have ever traveled to Persia. It is possible that some Jews ended up in Persia. There are Jews in Iran today, obviously, and there is evidence that there were Jews in that area, kind of during the time of especially during the time of Alexander the Great and the Hellenization of the region. But most of the Jews that left Babylon didn't go further away from Jerusalem. They went back to Jerusalem, and then eventually many of them went on to Alexandria in Egypt. So the description of, not just, they would have known what the capital of the empire was, of course, but that it's in the province of Elam and that he's near this waterway that has a name. How does he know that that's where he is? He shouldn't recognize it because it's unlikely that he would have ever been there. So that's kind of an interesting little wrinkle in the story. So I think that's just about all I've got for introduction. A little bit of setting kind of things to add in today, because we've got this heavier focus on the story from the perspective of the Jews. We are going to see, if we keep an eye out for it, some additional, I would call it nationalism, Jewish nationalism, the push toward wanting to be their own state, gain independence from their oppressors and from their overlords in the Seleucid Empire is evident in this story more so than it is in chapter 7. And it makes a lot of sense. If you are of this, if you're of the oppressed people and you're going through all of this suffering and dealing with the fact that these two warring empires are on either side of you, continually clashing in your area, and then the really bad, the people from the north come down and take over, and they're okay for a little while, but then Antiochus the Fourth comes in and he starts desecrating the temple and destroying everything and refusing to allow you to practice your religion. It goes from kind of being just a kind of baseline oppression. Now we're into the crisis level, and when you reach a crisis, now you're ready to revolt. So there is this undergirding of nationalism, this desire for independence that starts to bubble up during this time. And so the setting of the story that the book claims, that the story itself claims, is not, as we talked about, the actual setting when and where this story was written down in its final form, and that is in that period of time between 167 and 164 BC, when Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, has desecrated the temple. That happened in 167, and he outlaws Judaism, basically. And then in 164, you get the Maccabean revolt, and the Maccabees take over, and then the Jews are their own people. Judea becomes its own nation after that, at least for a short amount of time, until the Romans come in and take them over again. So that is the period of time that we're talking about here in terms of when this vision is supposed to be representing. So any questions about any background, anything that you've been thinking about since last week, anything like that before we jump into the text?
I don't have any.
Wow. Either I'm doing a great job or I'm just confusing you and boring you so much that you can't stand it.
No, everybody's taken over everybody every other year, it seems like.
Yes, that's pretty much how it goes. All right, so let's let somebody else talk for a little while and read this out so that we can all be on the same page. Who'd like to read today?
I'll read. I can read the first part, the actual vision.
Sounds great.
Get closer to the reading so I can see it. Okay. All right. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram ferociously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself upon to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated."
All right. Who wants to take the next section?
Oh, I'll take the next section here.
Right, thanks, Ben.
The interpretation of the vision. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Oops. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me up to my feet. He said, "I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princesses. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and the morning that has been given you is true. But seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding.
All right. Thank you, readers. So let me just quickly go through the vision itself and kind of explain what all the different pieces mean, and then we can get into some of the details that you all find interesting. So we have the ram that comes up first, and it has 2 horns. It represents the empires of the Medes and the Persians. The smaller horn is the Median Empire, which started, it was first, but then as Persia grew powerful, Persia actually kind of took over, and so it's called the Persian Empire, even though the larger chunk of it was originally the Median Empire. And if you remember or watched my supplemental presentation on the Persian period, Cyrus was actually the son of a Persian and a Mede. So he kind of brought the two empires together in terms of political allyship, and then was able to make it really great and start to invade and conquer other nations like the Babylonians. So we've got those two horns representing those two empires coming together to conquer the world. Then we have this goat that comes from the west. The goat is very clearly Alexander the Great. Very few scholars who are looking for original context meaning for this disagree that this is this is Alexander. You do have some people who are trying to look at this as something that will happen in their own future, so or you know, to interpret events that are part of their present. But people who are not doing that, people who are looking for the original context, all agree that this is about Alexander the Great. And the reason for that is because, like I showed you in the Greek period presentation, that was his animal, basically. That was how he was portrayed. On coins, you had images of Alexander as a goat. So he was the goat. So, and of course, the big horn is Alexander himself. And then when the large horn is broken early on, that represents the death of Alexander at the age of 33. And again, we talked about this last week, but he had no heir. And so 4 of his generals fought over who was going to be in charge. And finally, they decided that they were going to divide the kingdom into 4 different sections. So we had Cassander in Macedonia. We had Seleucus in Syria, so the Seleucid Empire. We had Ptolemy in Egypt and Arabia. And then we had Lysimachus in Thrace. So Cassander and Lysimachus are not really part of this story because they are more toward the west side of Alexander's empire, but Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, and Seleucus, the Seleucid Empire in Syria and Babylon, are the 2 warring factions that are trying to take each other over and trying to expand their empires. And because Judea is the little strip of land between those 2 empires, they kind of get the raw end of the deal on a lot of that war, and they end up being the site of a lot of the warring, and they end up having armies trampling through their fields all the time, and they kind of took a pretty serious beating during all that time. So again, when Antiochus III, Antiochus IV's father, wanted to take over Egypt, the Jews helped him with his attempt at conquest, and he won. And so in return for their assistance, he did not tax them. But then when he died, his son Seleucus was a little bit harsher on them, but still pretty much stuck with his father's way of doing things. But then he was mysteriously murdered, and instead of his own sons, who were the rightful heirs, taking over, his brother Antiochus IV, who was called Antiochus Epiphanes, took over the kingship. And so, of course, again, we've got the little horn that speaks arrogantly is Antiochus IV. So you can kind of tell that these people at this time really didn't like this guy. They had a lot of stories, a lot of negative portrayals of this guy because of everything that he did to them. And, you know, rightly so. In even within here, you can see some of the things that they feel are perpetrated against them. He destroys the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By cunning, he makes deceit prosper. And in his own mind, he shall be great. So they're, you know, really criticizing that he thinks that he's so awesome and he's so arrogant, but he's really not anything. You know, he forces them, he takes away their sacrifices and their practice of religion, and thinks that he's so wonderful. But even though he gets to destroy many and even rises up against the Prince of Princes, he shall be broken and not by human hands. So there's again that promise of restoration, promise that things will change. All right, so what other types of things would you like to talk about today? What details are in here that are of interest to you.
How come Daniel was used for interpreting dreams, but these last two stories, he's having other people interpret them for him? What's any thought on why it switches?
I think that because you know, you can interpret the entire book of Daniel as literally happening, as this guy Daniel having all of these visions and having all of these experiences. You can. There's nothing in it that prevents you from doing that. However, if you think about this from the perspective of it actually being written later in history, not actually written at the time of Daniel, and that Daniel is not necessarily a real person, or if he is a real person, he kind of grows up into this mythology of a person in the same way that we mythologize, you know, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. They were real people, but we make up these stories to teach moral lessons to our children using these character names so that people understand who we're talking about. So if Daniel is this figure among the Jews who is known for being someone who has a connection to God, is a faithful Jew, went through this horrible time, but maintained his faith in the proper way, and so he's someone to look up to, then over the course of the centuries, people continued to tell stories using Daniel as the main character of that story, even if it's something that didn't happen to him specifically. And so if you are trying to explain why is this happening now, and you have this apocalyptic, you know, why is God allowing this to happen? You can tell the story from the perspective of Daniel, who is this character from the distant past, who has visions, has a great connection to God, and you can explain what is happening now as if the person experiencing it is experiencing it as a future event. And so, but then you still need the interpretation of the dream. And so they write this in this way so that there has to be some kind of explanation. So Daniel, as the character, wouldn't necessarily understand what's going to happen, because the other dreams that he interprets for the other people are things that are happening in his own context. You know, we're talking about his interpretation of what's going to happen to, for example, Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. You are acting arrogantly, you're not taking care of your people, and you are weakening your social structure. And so if you can't get it together here, then you're going to lose your kingdom. And so that's, you know, I can interpret what's happening around you and what your dream is about. But this is about something that he has no connection to. This is not happening to him in his context. This is supposed to be happening in his distant future. And so I think it has something to do with that, you know, Daniel has the ability to interpret in his own context, but even Daniel, the greatest of all interpreters of all time, can't understand this stuff that's happening to us now. But what we do know is, because Daniel had a vision about it, God knew it was going to happen, and God was prepared for it, and God has it under control. So once again, it goes back to that bringing comfort to the people who are hearing this story. So if we attribute it not to somebody who is a contemporary of us, the people who are living in, you know, 165 BC, dealing with all this craziness that Antiochus is inflicting on them, instead of attributing this story to somebody from there, we attribute it backwards to Daniel, this person that we already know, already trust, already have an idea of kind of what kind of character he is. Now, it's not, this is just happening to us. This is something that was predestined for us. And so we just have to keep on keeping on, basically, until we get through this. Does that help?
Yeah, Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing that came to my mind was the mentions in the interpretation that the angel's name was Gabriel, which is the same angel that appeared to Joseph. Is Gabriel a common angel name, or is it supposed to be the same one, or which?
So in the Hebrew Bible, there is only one book that gives actual names to angels, and that's Daniel. So nowhere else is there an actual name given to one of these messengers from God. Daniel's the only one that gives any of these names. So Gabriel and Michael, we'll see Michael later appear, are the names of two angels that appear in these stories about from the book of Daniel. But everywhere else in the Bible, it just says an angel appeared, or a messenger from God appeared, or one of God, or a holy one of God, or something like that. It never says the name of any of them. So these names, I didn't do any research into where exactly they come from, but they do appear in a lot of the intertestamental writings that we don't have in our Bible, but a lot of those intertestamental writings are in the Catholic Bible, the Apocrypha, we call it. And those names are likely out of some of the other writings of that contemporary time, in that 1 or 200 BC to 180 kind of period. That in Judaism, the understanding of spiritual warfare and angels and things was really popular and really developing, and so they came up with these names, and they ended up filtering their way into the book of Daniel.
Do you know why? Oh, I'm sorry, Marge, go ahead.
Okay, would you talk about verse 14?
14. Yeah, so mine says, and he answered him, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So many scholars see this as 2,300 evenings and mornings means you take that and split it in half. So it's 1,150 days from 24-hour days. And so then they try to figure out, what this might refer to. One person, I wouldn't really call this person a scholar, but one person calculated this out based on the combination of this chapter plus the chapter that we're going to look at next week, chapter 9, that talks about the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and decided that the year 457 was the BC, was the year that this time period started. And then for them, 1,150 years from then, what would be 1844, the year 1844. And so this was one of the, not the earliest, but one of the earlier versions of the the kind of people who would try to get a following, and everybody believes that the end of the world is happening in 1844, and we have to be ready and sell all your stuff and give all your money to me or to this organization or wherever it's supposed to go, and get ready because Jesus is coming back in 1844. So we're familiar with these. These have happened several times in even recent years, and obviously that person was wrong. The world did not end in 1844. But the professor that I had who taught this class, this is not the popular opinion among scholars, but he believed that the 2,300 evenings and mornings is actually just a flowery way of saying 2,300 days. So he doesn't divide it in half. He doesn't say, there were 1,000 1,150 evenings and 1,150 mornings for a total of 1,150 days. He says a total of 2,300 days is what's involved here. And for him, what it is referring to is the amount of time between when Onias, who was the true high priest, and I went over this in my Greek presentation a little bit online, but Onias was the high priest in the temple after they had rebuilt the temple, and then through some political intrigue, his brother Jason took over the high priest position. And being the high priest was not just a job, it was a really prestigious position, and gave you a lot of access and a lot of at certain times wealth and things like that. So Jason wanted this position, and so he kind of manipulated the system and the kings to take over that position. And so in the 2,300 days is approximately the amount of time between when Onias was assassinated so that his brother could take over, and when the temple was rededicated and purged of the abomination that Antiochus IV had presided over when he slaughtered the pig on the temple altar and all that kind of stuff. So he's suggesting that approximately 6.5 to 7 years that represents 2,300 days is what they're referring to here. The amount of time between the assassination of Onias and the rededication of the temple. If the assassination of Onias represents the removal of the appropriate worship, that the person who is doing the sacrifices is no longer legitimate, and so therefore the sacrifices themselves are no longer legitimate, and the rededication of the temple when sacrifices are once again legitimate, that period is approximately 2,300 days. And so for him, that's what he thinks it's referring to. Now, I will also say once again that I don't really care either way that much. Certainly Dr. Sayao makes a better argument to me, but of course he made it to me in person. So, I'm probably biased in that way. But again, I don't really care myself about ferreting out exact dates and how long something is supposed to represent and all these kinds of things, because again, I'm not interested in the question, what is going to happen or when is it going to happen? I'm interested in the question, why is this happening? And so if we read this from that perspective, if we read it from that perspective, then I think the point is that there is an end to the suffering, that God has it under control, that God knows the appointed amount of time that this is going to last, but that we know, no matter what that number is, that it is a finite number, that this is not the end of the story, that there is going to be an end to this suffering and this experience, and things are going to turn around at some point. So whether you say, 2,300 days, whether you say a time times and half a time, whether next week we'll see the number 70 weeks, I don't really care what number you're using. I think the point of all of those numbers is, again, about the comfort, about the knowledge that God has it under control, that there is going to be an end to this. So that's what I know about that.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my question is, like, why are they telling all this? And that makes sense to me, that there will be an end, and that it's not out in the Ethernet somewhere. It's got a definite end.
Yeah. And I think, chapter 8 is is really helpful to me in terms of some of that, because of the perspective that it tells this story from. So it's the exact same story as chapter 7. It's almost a repeat of the same thing, but because it brings in even more heavily the fight between God, or this prince, whoever this prince is supposed to be, whether that prince is God or whether that prince is some kind of messenger from God, or whether that prince, the prince might represent, the legitimate high priest, whoever that's supposed to represent. It isn't Antiochus, the all-powerful emperor of this empire that is oppressing us, versus these tiny weak Jews who have absolutely no power and can't do anything. That is a hopeless situation to be in. If you are being oppressed and all you've got is you, then there's no hope, because you're just going to keep on getting squashed and squashed and squashed and squashed. There's nothing you can do about it. But that, according to this story, the answer to the question, not necessarily why is this happening, but what is happening, is not that Antiochus is squashing us. What is happening, the answer to that question is Antiochus is trying to squash God. And so it's God against Antiochus. And now all of a sudden the power dynamic shifts, because everybody knows that even though Antiochus is more powerful than the Jews, Antiochus is not more powerful than God. God might allow Antiochus to play his games for a little while, but eventually Antiochus is going to get his. And that is the source, I think, of hope for, in this particular story, the answering the question, what on earth is going on here? How can God allow this to happen to us? Well, we can't answer the question, why is God letting this happen to us? But we can answer the question, what is going on here? Well, God is in control. God is involved here. Antiochus is trying to slap God in the face, and God is only going to take that for so long before God steps in and makes things right again. What
That's
else do I
good.
have here? Yeah. Other things. I do have a few other ideas over here that we can get into, but I want to make sure we get everything you're interested in too. I don't want to just be the one that dictates what we're talking about. We talked a little bit about the development of Jewish nationalism. Antiochus's response to the Jews and deciding that he was tired of how the Jews behaved kind of backfired on him in a way, because if he had just kind of generally oppressed them and done what he was going to do, but allowed them to maintain their temple and all those types of things, then he would have been able to maintain his control. But the fact that he took away their religion, he desecrated their temple, it was too much for the Jewish people. And so that sparked the uprising to retake Jerusalem, to retake the temple, and that eventually happened in 164 under Judas Maccabeus, which is why it's called the Maccabean Revolt. And then the Maccabean dynasty of ruling by the Jews themselves, that nationalist undergirding of this whole thing is really Antiochus's fault. They probably would have continued to take his garbage if he had just left them alone. And it's interesting when you get to the Roman period and the New Testament, and we read about some of the events that occurred in relationship to the Romans, like, for example, the crucifixion of Jesus. That's a big one, where we get in front of Pilate, and we see that the Romans learned a lesson from this, that you can only do so much to these people before they snap. And one of the things that's most important to them is their religion. So their religion looks weird compared to ours, and it's annoying. And they have all these people coming in here to do their sacrifices on certain days of the year. And that's really dangerous, because when you get a ton of extra people in the city and they're from out of town, there might be riots, there might be people whispering together about coups, but we can't take that away from them, because if we do, that's what's going to set them off, and that's what's going to end up hurting us in the end. And that's what happened to Antiochus. And so the Romans didn't do that. They pushed really hard to allow the Jews to maintain their religion until they couldn't take it anymore. And then in the year 70 AD, they came in and they destroyed the temple themselves and squashed the whole thing for the last time. And that was the last time that there was a temple in Jerusalem. Let's see what else. Oh, so this is important. The idea of the end times. This chapter really heavily emphasizes phrases like the end of days. And so, when you read that on its face, the end of days to us means the end of the world, right? It's, Jesus is coming back and the whole new order is going to be put in place. Everybody is resurrected. Some people go to heaven, some people go to hell, all of these things that we assume when we see that kind of phrase, the end of days. But I wanted to point out that that is not what is being referred to in this particular instance. So the concept of the end of days, of the we call it the eschaton, which is a Greek word. Eschatology just means the end times, the study of the end times. And the development of that concept was very slow over the course of centuries. And you can see that development happening if you read different parts of the Hebrew Bible and kind of get a sense of some of what they believed at particular times historically. So originally there was no heaven in Jewish religion. They used the term Sheol to refer, but that was the pit. That was just, you died and that was it. But over the course of time, you see little hints of this coming through and slowly developing. So by the time you get to this 100 to 200 AD period, they aren't at the same place that we are, but they certainly have a sense of restoration, more so than the very, very early, I would almost call it proto-Jews, pre-Jews, rather than Jews proper. So the end of days refers to the restoration of the Jewish people to their homeland, to the restoration of David, to all those covenants that we talked about that were broken by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, those things are restored. So it's a new age of how God wants things to be. Justice and peace reign, all those types of things. But there's no sense that, and we maintain some of that, the idea that at the end of time, God will step in and make everything new, and there'll be the new Jerusalem and a new world. And some people, there are millennialists who believe that we will live in heaven for a certain amount of time, and then we'll be on this new earth, and there will be 1,000 years where we'll live on this new earth, that kind of thing. So for at this time, we don't have that sense of it kind of being outside of the physical realm. It's still in history, it's still within time, but it will look the way that God intends things to be. And so we start to see the development of kind of a restoration of Eden type of vision of what this looks like. But the end of days is not the end of the world. The end of days is the end of Antiochus and the beginning of how God intends for the Jews to live in Judea, with the throne of David established, with the temple established, with the right way of treating each other established, with the right way of practicing our religion established, with the Jewish people being independent and not oppressed by all these outsiders. It will be the way that God wants it to be. But the end of days doesn't mean no more days. The end of days means the end of these kinds of days, the end of these bad days, I guess you could say. So that's kind of a different understanding of what that means.
Well, this comes, Katie, from the entire Jewish setup all the way through history they were looking for a political or a general or a captain to come back and take over, not a savior sort of thing. That was their definition of savior, was somebody that makes us the Jews of old sort of thing.
Right, right. So that makes sense in terms of their understanding of who the Messiah is supposed to be. That this person is supposed to establish this time. So the Messiah will come at the end of days and reestablish the throne of David, and will reestablish the temple and make everything right, and we'll be able to continue to live. But this time we'll be able to live in harmony in the way that God intended for us as Jews to live.
That was their vision of heaven.
I don't know heaven, because
No, I mean, that's what they were looking for. That's what in their days I would call their vision of heaven, was
yeah, I mean,
earth.
it's kind of a heaven on earth type of situation. There is a term that comes out of this same time period in other Jewish writings. It doesn't appear in the Bible, but it basically means the new Eden. And so it's a restoration of, how God created the world to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
So is this referred to in Jewish writings that they use today?
You mean for understanding how things are
Yes.
going to work, or?
Right.
I mean, Daniel is in the Hebrew Bible, the actual Jewish Bible that they use to study and learn and pray and worship God in the synagogue. So they do read this, just like we would have a reading potentially from this on our Sunday morning services, and then like a sermon on it potentially. The interesting thing with Judaism is there are levels. There are several levels of scholarly interpretive writing that kind of have a hierarchy of authority. So you have the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. That's the core of their faith. Then you layer on top of that the history, the Nevi'im, and that is kind of the next level, but that also appears in the Bible, so it has that biblical authority to it. Then you add on top of that the writings, which is the Psalms, Daniel, the Proverbs, Esther, some of the other stories that are not understood to be historical writings, but are understood to be the prophets, that are understood to be interpretive writings. That also still is in the biblical text. But then you also have stuff that's outside of the biblical text that Christians don't have anything to do with. You have the Mishnah, which is they would take a big piece of parchment, and they would put a chunk of the biblical text in the middle, and then somebody would write commentary about that chunk of text all around it, on the page. So you'd have this little chunk of text, and then around it you would have the commentaries, and that's called the Mishnah. And that kind of interprets for you what that chunk of biblical text means. And that writing then, over the course of centuries, becomes authoritative in its own right. Not as authoritative as the Bible part, but still has some level of authority. So then eventually you get that kind of stuff getting codified into books. And then you have people who then take the little chunk of the Bible in the middle with the Mishnah writings around it, and then they put around that the Gemara, it's called, and that's the interpretation of that interpretation. And so the Gemara interprets the Mishnah, and the Mishnah interprets the Bible. And so then the Gemara, over the course of time, becomes its own, again, level of authority, not as authoritative as the Mishnah, not as authoritative as the Bible, but still has authority, and is still published and understood to be an important part of the way that we as Jews understand our faith and interpret our holy scriptures. So your question is kind of difficult because do they use this? Yes. But there are several millennia of additional interpretations of it to help them to understand what it means for them in that time period. And so as concepts develop and become more complicated and more complex, that gets codified into that Mishnah and that Gemara, so that this understanding of the end times is stuck in its own time period and isn't
Okay.
necessarily what they believe today, in the same way that it's not what we believe today. There are pieces of it. You can
Okay,
see-
so
No, go ahead.
so they don't use it as prophecy then. It's not, they like, if we're reading this part and we see it as prophecy or something like that, and not just dependent on that time period. I don't know. I'm not making myself clear.
I would say this. Most Jews find it amusing that Christians read this stuff and think that it is like a crystal ball and is going to tell them what's happening in the future.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
They do not, yes, Jews do not read this stuff as if it's going to tell them what's happening in the future. They read it as, again, prophecy, speaking truth to power, apocalypse, speaking truth to powerless, understanding what God is telling us through these situations that we're in, how God is relating to us in this time.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard to talk about this stuff because you can use the word prophecy in the way that we use it in our culture, but that's not what it means. So it's hard to, we kind of co-opted these words. Prophecy means crystal balls and apocalypse means the end of the world, but that's not actually what those words originally meant. And so when we talk about it in the context of Daniel, we have to be really careful about the words that we're using and how we're using them. It's a challenge.
But you could see why you could study that forever. That, the interpretations, just like we do. I mean, just you study it and study it and study it.
Yeah, and a lot of it's really fascinating. I mean,
Yeah.
But it's hard because it's also why the gospel writers are so hard on the Pharisees, because you get to a point where you've got, and because it's not just, when I say interpretation, like the Mishnah isn't just, oh, this is what this means. It's kind of a clarification of some of it. So for example, it says, you shall not work on the Sabbath. Well, what does that mean? We understand that traveling can be understood as work. So what is travel? How far can you travel on the Sabbath before you're violating the rule that you aren't to work on the Sabbath? And so in the Mishnah, it tells you that if you can walk so many miles or so many steps away from your home on the Sabbath, and that's not considered to be work. And so then people start to come up with ways to get around that. They would get tents and they would walk out halfway between where they're trying to go and where they live, and they will establish a little tent city there. And then on the Sabbath day, they can leave their house and walk so far before they would have to turn around to go back to their house, except now they have this second house that they have established, and so they can walk to that. And then from there, now that they're home, they can continue to walk on to their final destination where they're trying to get on the Sabbath day, because now their home is this tent, and so they can travel so far from their tent. And so that's the kind of stuff that was going on during the time of Jesus, that Jesus is criticizing. but it's not that Jesus is just criticizing the Jews in general, or, you know, the Pharisees in general, as their own specific thing, that they are the only ones who've ever done that. We do the same thing. You know, we come up with ways around what we know God wants us to do. We come up with our excuses. We establish ways to do whatever we want and still, you know, legitimize that in our religion. And so what Jesus was trying to say was, the point of this is not so that you can follow these laws to the T, but completely ignore the spirit of the law, which is you're supposed to stay home and rest and take this day off, even though it's really hard to give up this day and not get something done on this day. We know, you know, God knows that it's important for you to have this rest time. It's important for you to have this time with your family. And so do it. Do it right. Don't just try to get around it by using loopholes. And you know, and we do the same thing today. And so I don't know what you asked me, that why I was telling you that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought to circle that back around to what you had originally asked.
No, you did. Yeah, you answered it really well.
Okay, good.
Man, great story too.
Justify anything.
Yes, yes. Humans are good at that.
Yep.
Anything else coming out of chapter 8? I think I covered pretty much everything I wrote down here.
Hey, Katie, in verse 26, it says, the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distance. Did you tell them to just forget about it? Is that what we mean by seal it up?
Well, it's interesting because in chapter 7, some of the translations, I don't know if it was with this group or the other group, but somebody's translation said that he kept it to himself. He didn't share it with anyone. But that's kind of interesting, because if that's the case, you know, if we're looking at the story from within its own internal cohesion, then Daniel, this person, is supposed to be having this vision in the year, I don't know, 545 or something like that BC. And it concerns events that are going to happen in 165. So it's, you know, 400 years away. How is it that we found out about it if he didn't tell anybody for 400 years? So clearly, you know, that kind of internal consistency of the story from within isn't completely there. But I think here probably it means that, you know, why haven't we known about this for a lot longer? How come this vision is not coming out until now, when we're already in the midst of all of this? Would be a question that somebody would ask if you're trying to pass this off as an actual prophecy from Daniel and not just a story that provides comfort and sustenance to the people who are reading it. How come we didn't know about this before? You magically come up with this manuscript that's from Daniel, but now all the events that are described in it have already happened just now. Isn't that a little bit suspicious to me? Oh, well, you know, it was supposed to be sealed until the right time, and then it was opened, and that's why we now, you know, have access to it. I didn't write it. I found it, I swear. You know, that kind of thing. That's probably what's going on there.
Okay.
Got something, Ben?
Nope. It was just a comment that we do the same thing. We explain and explain and explain. We start with the Apostles' Creed, and then we go to Nicene Creed, and then the Athanasian Creed, just to constantly try to explain things.
Mm-hmm. because we want to know. I don't think there's
Well-
anything wrong with that. Being
No. I don't mean
being
that.
humans and being curious, and especially in times of trouble, we want to understand, we want to feel like we know what's going to happen and when this is going to be over and all that kind of thing. But I think, I think this kind of literature comes from that impulse that
Mhm.
we ask questions. How could God allow this to happen to us? We can't answer that question. The question of why do bad things happen? Why does God allow evil in the world? We can't answer those questions. But what we can say is that God has it under control, and that it will end when God wants it to end, that we are not powerless and alone, that God is with us, that God is experiencing this suffering alongside of us, and that if we're still suffering and it doesn't look the way that we understand that God wants it to look, that means that it's not the end of the story. And those things aren't necessarily satisfying when you're in the midst of real suffering, but it's kind of what we've got at this point. Well, I don't know if I want to bring this up because it might end up being a lot longer conversation than we have time for, but I thought it was interesting. I didn't catch this the first couple times I read it, but Steve, when you were reading verse 12, what did you say the first phrase was there in verse 12?
Verse 12. Give me a sec. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It
Yeah.
prospered. Everything it did in truth was thrown to the ground.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. Because of rebellion. My translation says because of wickedness, but rebellion kind of triggered in my mind thinking about that cycle of the relationship of the Jews to God that we've talked about before, that they get the law with Moses, and then they instantaneously break it and go into apostasy. And then the entire book of Judges is about that cycle, that they fall away, they're punished for it. God allows them to languish in their misery for a while because they're doing terrible things to each other and ignoring God. And then they are so miserable that they turn and they cry out to God, "Oh, God, save us." So God sends them a judge to help them get out of it and reestablishes the whole relationship. And yes, now, thank you, God, we're going to definitely worship you properly and live the way that you want us to live now. And then that lasts for about 5 minutes until they start falling away again. And then the whole cycle starts all over again, and they get a new judge, and they cry out to God for help, and then they get reestablished, and it cycles through like that. And so when you said that, because of rebellion, I thought that was an interesting interpretation, an interesting translation for that word, because it almost seems like, why is this happening? Because God is punishing you. And I really have a hard time with that. Thinking about God using this kind of situation to punish the people, to show them the error of their ways so that they'll turn back to God, or something like that. But that's certainly how they interpreted it for the Babylonian exile. So I'm sure some people were interpreting it the same way at this time, that, why did God take away the temple from us? Why did God take away our legitimate high priest? Well, we must have done something wrong. What did we do? I feel like even that is a coping mechanism, because even if you understand that God is punishing you for something, you still have more control over the situation than you would if it was just happening to you for no reason. Well, I deserved this, and all I have to do is turn and become, act better, do a better job, and then this will go away. Versus, oh, well, I didn't really do anything to deserve this suffering, but it's happening to me. And so because I didn't cause it, I have no control over it ending. And so I'm just kind of stuck. I have no power. I have no ability to address this. And so in some ways that kind of makes sense. And I feel like we still do that today. You know, we've got people out there who are claiming that the coronavirus is a worldwide punishment from God because we are all evil and don't worship God properly. And so all this is happening because God sent it to us to punish us. And that sounds, crazy in the same way that when Pat Robertson was saying that the earthquake in Haiti was a punishment because the Haitians are so bad and wicked, that was a punishment against them. But it makes some kind of perverse sense, because if you can say this is happening to us because we were bad and God is punishing us, then you now have control over the situation in a way that you didn't before, because now you know what you need to do. You know how to fix the problem. Turn, worship God, act justly, do what God wants you to do. Go to church on Sunday, stop being so secular, and then everything will be better again. And so, it kind of makes sense to me that is the impulse when bad things happen on a large scale, to say, oh, well, we're being punished. Because if we're being punished, then the punishment will be over, and we can prevent ourselves from having that punishment happen again. Whereas without that, we've got a pandemic. We don't really understand how it happened. We don't really understand how it's affecting people. We don't really understand how long it's going to be around. We don't know if we're going to be able to develop a vaccine for it. And so we feel very powerless. We feel a lot of anxiety around all of those unknowns. So I thought that was an interesting translation that brought up a different kind of perspective on that.
And in my translation, it says transgression. It uses the word transgression.
Interesting.
So, and then it says, and it will fling truth to the ground. I thought that was an interesting line too. It will fling truth to the ground. So. So maybe that's what they did wrong.
Mm. Yeah, the Antiochus stuff with him. Where was that part? Toward the beginning. The little horn grew toward the south, which is obvious. They wanted to take over Egypt. Toward the east, they took over more land in the direction of China, toward the beautiful land, of course, being Judea. But then it grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to the earth some of the host and some of the stars and trampled on them. So this chapter framing it not as a fight between Antiochus and the Jews, but between Antiochus and God. Antiochus is attempting to take over God's position, to conquer God. And so then we can now go back to Nebuchadnezzar. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he was arrogant and didn't give God the proper authority and thought that he was the best? What happened to Belshazzar when that happened to him? So again, it makes sense that these stories would recycle and come back, because they provide that kind of hope that no, Antiochus isn't gone yet. He's still here, but look at all the other kings that we've encountered, and God took care of them. They got theirs eventually, and Antiochus is going to get his too. All right, well, I think we pretty much covered it here. Any final thoughts? Last minute questions?
No, but I think what you said about, when Ben asked you what your interest was, and you gave your explanation, that would be I would be interested in learning more about that.
Not practical theology?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Browns and Martinez's, before you guys got here, we were just talking about how we're running out of chapters in Daniel, and so we'll have to decide what we want to do at the end here. We'll have next week we'll do chapter 9, and then after that chapters 10 through 12 are actually all one unit together, and chapter 12 isn't very long, so we might be able to last through chapters 10 through 12 for 2 weeks, but we certainly won't need 3 weeks on it. So we're really only going to have a maximum of 3 more sessions on Daniel. So we were kind of talking about, do we want to continue this Zoom thing weekly and have another type of thing to do next? Or do we want to take a break for the summer? And so Ben just asked me what my particular interest is, and I told him that practical theology is my thing. And there are, I had a professor in seminary who wrote a book about practical theology, and he suggested that there are 4 questions that you should ask in order to figure out how to do theology in your life. So that could be something that we could do. We could do a 4-session series on practical theology and those 4 questions, and talk about how that works and why those are important questions to ask, something like that. So maybe we could do that. We have a little more time to think about it. So if you all want to kind of ponder what your thoughts are, do you want to keep doing something else? Do you want to do another Bible book and move forward in the same kind of way, or do you want to do something a little different, or would you rather just take the summer off? We can kind of do a little bit of chatting about that next week maybe, so that I can figure out what we want to do next. Okay. Do we have a brave volunteer who would like to pray us out today?
I think I did last time.
I believe you did, Karen.
The time before that.
All right, Ben and Karen are off the hook.
Too much pressure.
No, I can do it.
Yeah.
All right,
yeah,
thank
Um,
you, Karen.
Oh God, we do trust you when we look to the ending of things that are so uncomfortable to think about in our lives, and knowing that you are in control and that we do know the ending to these stories, and that you are always with us. We trust you and believe in you and love you. Amen.
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 Thank you very much.
Eh,
Right.
Thank you.
Good night.
Have a great week.
Thank you.
Yes, have a great week.
See you next week.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.